Welcome back to a new little VBA tutorial. So now that we have the trading robot done for the time being, I'm going to start kind of going into other languages again. So more VBA, even the JavaScript API. I know we have the add-in stuff we still need to work on. And then I really would like to revisit the M language too. I think that's a pretty interesting topic as well. So in today's video, we are going to go in Excel VBA, and more specifically, we are going to talk about pivot charts. And so this is actually an interesting object. I really like doing this tutorial because it's weird. It's a little bit weird in the sense of you don't work with the object that you would normally think the way you would. And that's like, I think it's just when I looked online for tutorials on it, I was kind of surprised. I said, oh, this is interesting. I said, it doesn't seem intuitive that I would create a pivot chart this way, but supposedly this is how we do it. And you could kind of tell people were like asking the same questions, like, especially if they've been working with pivot tables, they understand there's all these objects in there and things like that. And it's very easy to create a pivot table because there's a lot of different objects. There's not really a pivot chart object. Instead, you'll find that we're going to use a regular chart object, but the data source that we're referencing, somehow by referencing a pivot table, it knows that it will then be a pivot chart. So very interesting. I really would have thought that it would have its own kind of object, but it doesn't really appear to have that. So it's interesting. It'll make more sense, obviously, when we go into it. But ideally, we want to recreate what we're seeing right here, which is we have a pivot chart. It's nothing too fancy. And we have a pivot table that is linked to this chart. And so that way, if I go here and clear my filters, I should see more, right? So again, you would never put a chart like this, but this is just to demonstrate that ideally we're going to do something like this. So the goal is to take this data set here. We're going to create a pivot table from it, and then we're going to create a pivot chart from that pivot table. So with that being said, let's do a little bit of cleanup by first getting rid of our chart. And then from here, where is it? Pivot table analyze. I want to know if I can do it like this. Oh, I can. Cool. And then I do the entire select one, and then you can delete it like that. Okay, so from here, we're going to go into our developer tab, and then we're going to go to our Visual Basic icon. We'll click it. The new window opens up. And then from here, you need to insert a new module. So right over here from your Project Explorer, you can right click, go down to Insert, and then you're just going to click this little module icon, and it will insert a new module. You should give your module a name that obviously tells what it does. In this case, I'm doing pivot chart video. So this is that way I know that this is for my pivot chart. And then in this case, because I'm recording it, it's for my video. Okay, then from here, let's create a new subroutine. We'll call it create pivot chart. And then we're going to declare our variables, just like we've done in every other VBA video. We want to leverage IntelliSense. In order to leverage IntelliSense, we need to define the variables that we plan to use beforehand, so that way we can benefit from code completion and just general error checking. Okay, so the first one is going to be called data workbook. This is going to be a workbook object. This is obviously the workbook that we're currently in. And then we're going to declare a couple worksheet objects. So the first one is data source sheet. This will be a worksheet object. This is going to be the worksheet that contains our data table. And then we're going to define another one. And then we're going to call this data chart sheet. This is going to be another worksheet object, and this one will house our pivot chart. Then we are going to do data source table. This will be a list object, because if you look on my workbook, you can see right here that this is not just a range of cells. This is a list object. A lot of people also call it data tables, Excel tables. There's different nomenclature for it, but at the end of the day, in VBA terms, it's a list object. And so we want to make sure we can reference that list object. So we want to make sure we declare a variable, so that way we can store it. Okay, and the next couple variables are going to be related to a pivot table. So the first one is going to be Excel pivot cache. This will be a pivot cache object. A pivot cache object is basically kind of like an in-memory cache that takes all your information, stores it in there and makes it where it does nice fast calculations and makes using a pivot table very easy and intuitive. So this is kind of the behind the scenes brain that is storing all that information and making the results come out fast when it needs to aggregate and stuff like that. So really cool. There's different types of pivot caches depending on the version of the pivot table you're using, but we're just going to use the default one for our 2016 version or Microsoft 365. Okay, then we're going to have a pivot table. This is obviously a pivot table object that we would normally insert in our worksheet. And then inside of our pivot table, oh, hold on, let me respell that really quickly. Inside of our pivot table, we have pivot fields. And so a pivot field is basically a field, and normally the way I like to think about it is our columns in our data table. So each one of those columns is a field inside of our particular pivot table. So your columns in your tables are your fields in your pivot table. And then those fields can belong to one of four categories. They can be a filter, they can be a row, they can be a value, or they can be a column. So you can put your columns in four different categories of fields. Okay, so this is the next one. Again, not super intuitive, but technically when you create, what is it? I think when you create a pivot chart, when we're creating the chart, we're actually returning a shape object. And so we need to first grab that shape. And then what we can do is we can take the shape and then grab the chart property of it. So this is where, again, not super intuitive. This is just something you'd have to look on examples and look on Microsoft documentation to actually know that what is being returned back when you're using the add chart method is actually a shape. It's not a chart. So even though it's not intuitive, just keep that in mind. It's nothing too crazy. And then our chart does have different parts or different objects that belong to it. One that we are going to be working with is an axis. I actually do have a series on working with charts, and so that actually goes perfectly with this one because a lot of the same objects we used in that one you can use here. So this one I might use a couple different objects in a different fashion just to give you, again, some experience seeing things done differently. But just keep in mind, I do have a series on the charts, and I will put that down below. So that way, if you want to use those as kind of a extension of this particular series, you can easily do it. Okay. So first things first, let's define our workbook. This is super easy. We're just going to take that set Excel data workbook and set it equal to this workbook property. This workbook means the workbook that contains the code that I'm currently writing. So that's a nice, easy way to reference the workbook that contains your code. Otherwise, you can access the workbook doing a naming convention or many different ways. I find this one to be the most reliable, especially if you're working with a macro-enabled workbook. Normally, you should try to keep your code where it only references that particular workbook. Now, again, there's many scenarios where you don't need to do that, but that's just from my experience. Okay, then from here, let's define the data source sheet, and then we're going to set that Excel data source sheet equal to Excel data workbook. And then we're going to do worksheets. And my worksheet is called USA Daily All. So if you saw my series on the COVID-19 analysis, I still need to finish that one. This is actually using the same data source there. It actually goes great for creating pivot tables and pivot charts. So I thought, hey, perfect opportunity to utilize some data we have for some other videos and use it in some of our VBA series. If you do want access to that workbook, I did post it on my Facebook page. I will put a link to that in the description below. I personally love that data set. It's a nice large one. There's a lot of different data types, gives you an opportunity to work with dates, numbers, text, geographic data. So really cool. I highly encourage if you want kind of like a nice, good, solid data set to kind of practice on different things. This is definitely the one I would encourage you to look at. Okay, and then define the sheet that will house our pivot chart. So we're going to say Excel data chart sheet equals Excel data workbook dot worksheets, and then we're going to say USA Daily all, and then chart. Let's just run it really quickly, make sure there's no errors. Again, I've been known to misspell things in the past, shock, but I'm trying to get better about, writing a little bit so it doesn't cause a bunch of errors midstream. Okay, so then from here, let's set the data table, data source table. Again, this is our list object, and so we'll do Excel data source table equals Excel data source sheet, and then we'll do the list object, so list objects collection, and then we're going to do daily United States all. A lot of people will probably ask, where did you get that name? Well, remember, with list objects, you can give them names. So if you go under the Table Design tab, you will notice under the Properties, you can actually give it a name. I always make people do this when they send me stuff, because the last thing I'm going to start doing is referencing Table 1, and then Table 111, then Table 1111. Again, that's not intuitive. Make it where other people can know what you're doing. Okay, so then from here, we have our data source table. Let's create a pivot cache, and we'll use this as our data source. We'll use our list object as our data source. So the next thing we'll do is we'll create a pivot cache, and then we want to make sure we store that in a variable as well. So we'll have our pivot cache variable equal to access the pivot caches collection. It's at the workbook level. And so you go this workbook, or actually in this case, let's be a little bit smarter about it. We'll do our Excel data workbook, and then we'll do pivot caches. And then there is a create method, and that create method will allow us to create a new pivot cache. We do need to specify the source type. And so in this case, our source type is going to be a database. Really, that's just kind of an Excel table, an Excel range. And then we're going to have our source data. And our source data in this case is the actual pivot, I'm sorry, not pivot, the list object itself. So we'll say Excel data source table. And then to make our lives easier, just use the name of it. So the name property will return the name. If you provide the name of the table in the source data argument, then it knows to reference that list object. And then we have the version. In this case, if you're just on the latest version of Excel, just use 6. If you're not sure, what I would recommend that you do is just do a macro record where you record yourself creating a pivot table. It will always have the version there. So I did that when I was actually exploring a little bit on how to do this. And so when you create a pivot cache, it will tell you the default version. So again, don't be afraid to use the macro recorder if you're not sure. I know a lot of people are on different versions of Excel, whatever it is. So, just, again, don't be afraid to use it. Oh, this one's a little bit different. I guess they do default version, and I had version. That's interesting. Did it actually say version? Oh, no, it says version. Oh, interesting. Yeah, it's still pivot caches. Oh, no. Sorry. I saw create pivot table. It's versions up here. Sorry. So yeah, that's right. I got a little confused for a second. Okay, so now that we have a pivot cache, we can create a pivot table. So let's create our pivot table. So we'll create a pivot table, and we'll set our Excel pivot table equal to our Excel pivot cache. And then there is a create pivot table and a create pivot chart. Now, if you were like me, you looked at this and go, oh, I should use create pivot chart, and that will create a pivot chart for me that returns some kind of chart object. I was never able to get this to work. And from what I can tell, I couldn't find anybody else who could get it to work. They have an example on the Microsoft documentation. It's there, but it's very specific. And so part of me is possibly thinking that you can use this method, but it's not using a pivot. I don't want to say pivot cache. It sounded like it was an external data source. So again, I'm not entirely sure why it doesn't work. I wasn't actually able to find a working example. Everybody who was able to get it to work is going to do the method that I'm going to show you, but there is a method there. If someone's able to get it to work using a pivot cache, using, like an Excel table, I would be more than willing to look at that, because personally, I wasn't able to get it to work. So it could have just been something I wrote incorrectly, or I maybe was referencing something incorrectly. But again, if you can get it to work, I'd be happy to take a look because I would like to know personally. So with a create pivot table, we need to specify a couple things. The first thing is the table destination. And so this is where the table is going to go. And in this case, it does expect a range object. So in this case, I'm going to say data chart sheet, and then I'm just going to specify the range. In this case, I'm going to specify range A2. Now, there's a couple other arguments that I could specify, like the name, default version and stuff like that. You don't technically just need to specify that. The only argument that you do need to specify that is required is where you want this pivot table to go. Behind the scenes, Excel will make some of those other assumptions for you. So for example, like name, it will be pivot table 1 or whatever it's on. But just keep in mind that you don't technically need them. Personally, if you want to make it a little bit more explicit, it's probably better to name it. Okay, so let's just see what this will do. Let's make sure this works as good. So I just ran it. Let's see if we have a pivot table. So this looks good. We have a pivot table. Obviously, there's no fields that have been allocated to the different categories, but we do have a pivot table, albeit a blank one. So what I'd like to do from here is take this pivot table and create a pivot chart from it. And so what we're going to do is we're going to add a chart to our particular sheet. And then what we're going to do is we're going to set the data source for that particular chart. So again, this is where things can kind of get not intuitive, but just bear with me and we'll walk through it. Alrighty. So the next thing is we're going to create our shape. I'm going to call it a pivot shape just so that way when I'm referencing it, I kind of know like, okay, so that's the shape that's basically going to be used as my pivot chart. So I'm going to say create the quote unquote pivot shape. And so we'll say set Excel pivot shape equal, we're going to go to our Excel data chart sheet. There is a shapes collection that belongs to each sheet. And then from there is an add chart to method. This will add a chart for us. We do need to specify some things. Style is optional. You don't need to do it, but that's just kind of the overall style. What I'm really concerned at with this point is the chart type. I do want a specific chart type. I want the Excel, Excel chart type. And then I want, what did I want? Excel column stacked 100. So I want the bar chart that has 100% of 100%. And then there's a couple other things. This is more just, no, I don't want that. Come on. This is more for just positioning of it. So where is it going to go when you put it on here? So the first one will be the left value. So that's going to be 100. Yes, I know. The next one is going to be top. This will be 100 as well. And then the next one is going to be the width. That's also going to be, no, this one's going to be 900. So this is going to make it a nice wide chart. And then we're going to do the height equal to 300. And then that's actually all we need for that. So this will create a shape. Keep in mind, this is just a shape. It's just a chart shape. It's nothing fancy. To prove that to you, we're going to run it again. And I'm going to show you what it looks like. So right now, we have a pivot chart, and then we have a pivot table. So you can see here, everything looks good. Again, to me, it's not intuitive. Like I see pivot chart, but then I'm adding it through a shape, and I know it is what it is. It's just interesting that, that you don't have like a specific like add pivot chart method that belongs to it with the shapes or something. So, and the other thing too, and maybe I didn't see it correctly, there doesn't seem to be an add chart either. So I don't know if this is something where it's like when you add chart or add chart to, like maybe it's different, but because, there's regular chart objects, but by default, I never consider them a pivot chart. They're just usually normally a chart. So what we're going to do from here is we're going to grab the chart property from the shape object, and then we're going to set the data source. So what is it? Grab the chart. And so we're going to set Excel pivot chart equal to the Excel pivot shape. And then there's a chart property. And that chart property is basically returning our chart object. Then from here, we need to set the data source. And so we'll say Excel pivot chart. There is a set data, where is it? Set source data method. And then the source just needs to be a range object. Now in this case, because we have a pivot table object, there is a table range 1 and a table range 2 method. I think table range 2 is like it doesn't include the filter or something like that. Normally I just go with table range 1. That's the one that has always worked for me. So just do table range 1. I don't know the exact difference off the top of my head between the two. I think it has something to do with when you're selecting whether you're including the filter or not, something like that. Just as a note too, technically speaking, you can also reference it something like this. There's a pivot layout. So there's a pivot. Where is it? Oh, I'll kind of talk about this in a second. I don't want to necessarily get right into that. Okay, so let's see what happens here. We'll delete that and then we'll run it again. Let's see what happens. Okay. So now it looks like we have our source data, so that's good. And then what we're going to do from here is we're going to start adding the different fields to it. So now we're going to kind of jump back to the pivot table. So this is also an important note when you are working with this object. If you want to change the pivot chart, you got to change the pivot table. So you don't change the chart, you change the table. So that's important. Again, visually, if you want to change the chart, you got to change the table, not the other way around. So from here, what I'm going to start doing is I'm going to go into my pivot table and I'm going to start referencing different fields and I'm going to start positioning those fields. It's going to be very repetitive, so I will start copying it at some point, but it's going to normally look like the following. So for example, let's imagine I want to grab the date parse field, right? So I'm going to say grab the date parsed field. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to say set Excel pivot field. So I have that object. I'm going to go into my Excel pivot table, and then I have a pivot fields method, and then I can select the particular one using the name or even an index. In this case, just use the name. Otherwise, people are going to get confused. And also as a side note, I can reference my pivot table like this, or if I want to kind of do it a different way, just so you can see it, I can go Excel pivot chart. There is a pivot layout and there's a pivot table property as well. So that's another way to access that pivot table if you need to do it a different way. But this way, I think it's just a little bit more concise and it's just referencing the original one. Okay, once I have a field, I'm going to add my field to my table. So I'm going to add the date parsed field to the table. And so when I put it into the table, there's a couple things. So I'm going to say with Excel pivot field, because I'm planning to change multiple properties about it. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to specify the orientation. The orientation is basically saying which category of fields do I want it to be in. In this case, I want my date parse to be an Excel column field. And then from here, the position is the position within that category. Right now there's none, so it's all automatically going to be 1. But say I want it to be the second field, so I think it's like, it would be, then date parse, so it'd be like date parsed, and then it would be like, just say like name or something like that. So it's like outer or inner or something like that, if I remember correctly. And then the neat thing with dates is you can actually auto group them. And so what that means is you can make it where the dates are grouped by month, by quarter, by year, whatever it is. But that's really nice when you want to make your pivot table a little bit more dynamic. So I encourage everybody to do this with dates. It does make it a little bit easier to work with them. So you just want to do the auto group method, and then that will group your dates. So let's see what it would look like now with just one field. Again, nothing fancy. What happened? Did I misspell it? Oh, I did misspell it. Look at that. date parse. I put data parsed. So let's try again. Okay, perfect. That looked good this time. You can see now that I have my columns here, and they've also been grouped, which is very handy. So now I can easily just expand and collapse as I need. My pivot chart has changed right now. So because I do have a field there, it's made it blank, but I obviously can't see anything. So that's kind of not helpful, but it's showing that we're slowly progressing, building our more quote unquote complex, you know, pivot chart. It's nothing complex, but we can call it whatever we want. Okay, so I'm just gonna start copying a few of these again. Again, it's almost identical each time, so I don't wanna spend a ton of time just kind of retyping everything. In this case, really all we're doing is we're just changing the field that we're selecting, and we're just changing where we're putting it. So for this example, I'm gonna put my positive cases in my data field, and then I'm gonna grab my next one. And so my next one is going to be my filter, and that's gonna be my data quality grade. Data quality grade. And in this case, I want this to be a page field. And so with a page field, this is actually like our filter. And again, all these are still gonna be position ones. And then when we actually do the auto group up here, it does create another field for us. So in this case, it actually creates, well, it's gone now, but it creates a month field. And so we can actually take that month field and we can put it into another part of our pivot table. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna grab that month field and I'm gonna put it in my row field or my row category field. And that's pretty simple. I'm just gonna change that from page to row and go from there. And then I'm gonna do one final thing. I'm gonna change the color of my chart before we go on to the next section. So we'll take our pivot chart. I'll change my chart color and I'm gonna put it to 18. It's just basically the enumeration for like the blue category or whatever it is. So let's run it again and see what happens. Let's see what happens. Oh, months. There's an S at the end. My apologies. All right, let's get rid of that really quickly. I'm gonna delete this again. And let's see what happens. Perfect. Wonderful. Okay, so that looks a lot better. So now we have our months along this axis, and then we have a chart. It's got the blue coloring and stuff like that. So we got this massive pivot table, and it's like, oh, all fancy, right? Ooh, don't want that. So let's keep going on, and we'll start doing some more formatting now. So now we're gonna kind of jump to our chart, and then what we're gonna do is we're gonna start doing some formatting aspects about it. Personally, I hate grid lines, and so I always get rid of grid lines the first thing I do. So I'll take my pivot chart, I will go to my axes collection, and then I'll say for my value axes, I know it has a major grid lines property, and I'm gonna call that delete method, and that will delete the grid lines from that chart. And then from here, I'm big on font too, so I'm gonna change the font. In this case, I'm gonna say with Excel pivot chart, there is a chart area. There is a format object. Inside that format object, there is a text frame 2 property. Inside of that, there is a text range property, and then inside of that, there is a font property. My God, that was one of the longest ones that we have to do, but it does also show some of the complications. Now, from here, I'm gonna change the name to Roboto. I do have that installed on my system so I can use it. If you don't, then you can do something like, you know, Arial, you can do Arial Nova, whatever you wanna call, different things like that. And then with this one, I gotta double check and see. I think maybe I have to define a few other properties before I can run this perfectly, but let's try it really quick. And then I guarantee you I misspelled something. I did, I misspelled grid lines. Okay, perfect. Okay, great. So our font's been changed. The grid lines are now gone, so that's perfect. And then our pivot table's also been updated as well. So let's keep going on. So we're just changing more of the formatting stuff now. What I want to do is I actually want to change my filter, right? So you know what? I don't want to show every month. I actually want a very specific subset of months. I'm being very particular now. So I'm going to grab the date field. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say set Excel pivot field equal to Excel pivot table. I'm going to go to my pivot fields method, and then I'm going to put in date. I did it again. Date parsed. And then from here, I'm going to add a filter. So add a filter that only selects this quarter. So this is actually a new thing they've added in Excel. This has been around for a while, but I never started using it a lot until, I'd say, probably like a year or two ago. So if you go to pivot filters, there's an add to method, and then there's a type, and that type equals the different types of filters. So in this case, with the dates, there are a ton of them, and you can see all the different ones. And so you can see period, lots of different stuff. The one I'm really concerned about is Excel date this quarter. And then once I've done that, that's actually all I need at a minimum to add that filter. There's obviously more options you can do, but again, that's for a later time. Okay, and then I'm going to add some data labels. So I'm going to say Excel pivot chart. I'm going to say set, not that, set element. And then I'm going to say element MSO element data label center. So this will put data label center in each of the little elements. And I'm going to basically copy this section of code and just add some different elements to it, or maybe just change certain properties about it. So in this case, set the legend. In this case, I want my element to be my legend to the top. So I want it to be on the top. And then what I'm going to try to do is just make sure everything's spelled correctly. I want to remove the primary value axis. So I'm going to say MSO element primary value axis none. And then I'm going to change something else about this as well. This one, primary value axis title adjacent to axis. So that puts it like, I think, right below it. And then I'm going to grab the value axis. So I'm going to say set Excel chart axes equal to Excel pivot chart. I want the axes method, and then I'm going to specify the type. It's like an axes collection if you want to think of it. So grab the value axis, and then what am I doing from there? Oh, I'm changing titles. That's why. Ooh. Am I? Maybe I'm not. Oh, that's the one I couldn't get to work. So I'm going to hold off on that one. However, I will set the title for the primary title, primary category. I am going to set one more element right here. Primary category. Category axis title adjacent to axis. Yes, okay. Okay, perfect. This one, I'm going to change it from value to Excel category. This one will be the category axis. And then from here, I'm going to set the caption. And I'm going to say Excel chart axis dot axis title. I'm going to do the caption property. I'm going to say put that as the month. And I'm going to set the font to bold. And I'm going to basically take this little portion, and then I'm going to cheat a little bit. I'm going to go to the format property, then the text frame, then the text range, and then the font, and then I'm going to go to the bold property. I'm going to set that to true as well. So that will change it to bold. And then finally, at the end of it, I'm going to change the chart name. I'm going to say Excel pivot shape dot name equals COVID analysis. Now, you might be asking, why are you going to the shape? Why not the chart? So that one will always return an error for some reason. If you go to the chart object and you change the name, it gives you this little weird thing about running out of memory. I was never able to get a fix on that one, but this seems to do the same exact thing. So I think the chart is actually more of like a kind of a special thing that the name aspect, at least from what I could tell, you couldn't really change. Okay, so that's all good and done. Let's try it. Let's hope there's no errors. Oh, that was surprising. But you can now see we have definitely a much cleaner chart right now. In this case, we do have a filter that is currently active, and you can see it's this quarter. We have our caption, the font has been bolded, and then we have some data labels, and so they've been put into the center of it like we asked. And then we also have our wonderful little legend that has now been put across the top, and everything looks good. Now, with that being said, let's make sure, I hope the chart name was changed. I don't know if it was or not. Oh, it was changed. Wonderful. So it was changed, which is great. But really at that point, that's kind of just, I would say, building a pivot chart. So, taking a data source, creating the pivot table, and then creating the pivot chart from that pivot table. Now, obviously, there's a lot more you can do with charts. Now, with that, though, I am going to kind of reference you back to the other series I built, just because at this point, you're working with a chart. That information is already there. How you would work with a pivot chart compared to a regular chart is exactly the same. The only thing really that differs with your pivot chart is what you visually will see is dependent on what you have in your pivot table. So it's not necessarily about grabbing your chart and changing certain things about it. It's more about, if I want to see certain things in my chart, I have to technically go back to my pivot table. So I have a series on pivot tables, and I also have a series on charts. Really, if you go through those two and then you go to this one, you should be pretty comfortable doing the pivot chart, or at least getting to the point where you can find the things that you need to find. So if you do have any questions, by all means, put them down in the comments below, and I will do my best to answer them. Otherwise, we will see you in the next video. I'm trying to think for VBA, what's next? I think I was going to do something with add-ins. I think I was going to show how to do a VBA add-in, if I remember correctly. But this is this is specifically for Excel. And then also I do want to cover some more stuff in PowerPoint and Word. And I might, if I can, I'm not positive I'm even going to start this series, but I'm going to at least start exploring a little bit about possibly working with OneNote using VBA. That's a very different object model in the sense of how you access it, but supposedly you can. I've never personally done it, but I am kind of curious to see what it would look like, and seeing maybe how we can play with it. So thank you again for watching, everybody. We'll see you in the next video.